Hi guys, having trouble sleeping tonight again? Maybe you're tossing around in your blanket, staring at the ceiling, and your mind is wandering through the strangest corridors of history, like medieval dungeons, chastity belts, and whether they actually worked. You're not alone. You picture it now, some poor maiden strapped into a metal contraption, clanking around the castle like a tin can with legs, while her knight gallops off to war. There's a lock, there's a key, and somewhere there's a very uncomfortable bathroom situation waiting to happen. Sounds impossible. Well, you might not survive this story, but don't worry, only metaphorically. Before we begin, a little favor tap subscribe and give us a thumbs up to help our bedtime story family grow. Now snuggle in and let tonight's story guide you softly into a night full of calm and beautiful dreams. Why not take a second to share your local time and where you're tuning in from? Or maybe just drop a little note about how you're feeling right now. Are you anxious, calm, curious, tired? You'd be surprised how comforting it can feel just to say it. Maybe pull a blanket a little tighter around you. Listen to the quiet sounds of your room and prepare to drift peacefully into our tale. The image comes first. A dim, torch-lit hall stone walls, glistening with moisture. The faint scent of old iron and dried herbs. You see a narrow wooden chest, its lid cracked slightly, revealing what looks like a medieval chastity belt. Your fingers hover above it, cool metal, strange hinges, a crude keyhole. The kind of thing you'd expect in a horror movie, dungeon, or perhaps a museum full of Victorian oddities. But this isn't just fiction or film. This object, whether myth or tool, has haunted imaginations for centuries. Let's be honest, just the phrase chastity belt makes you shift a little under your blanket. It conjures something equal parts absurd and sinister. The idea of someone trying to secure another's body with metal as though affection and desire could be denied with a lock and key. But is it even real? You walk slowly through the history and everything feels a little hazy. The earliest mentions of such belts don't come from noble knights or lonely wives. They come from texts far removed from the Middle Ages. In fact, the term chastity belt, as we know it, only gained popularity in the 19th century. Weird, right? Still, there are earlier whispers. The poet Conrad Kaiser described such devices in his military treatise Belleforts around 1405, showing a woman wearing a locked belt. But it wasn't a manual for lovers. It was satire. Kaiser was laughing, not instructing. Historians still argue whether any of these references were sincere or symbolic. Was it a joke about paranoid husbands? A metaphor for female virtue? Or did someone somewhere actually try to make their lover wear one? You take another step into the dark hall of history, your mind filled with clicking latches and imagined jingling keys. The belts themselves, when you see them in museums, look theatrical. Iron straps, dramatic locks, barely human dimensions, often too small for an adult woman, or arranged in ways that make wearing them well physically implausible. Some were clearly fakes. In the 1800s, museums and collectors got a little too excited. They gobbled up supposed medieval chastity belts without much scrutiny because the idea was too delicious, too scandalous, too sellable. A fringe merchant or an opportunistic blacksmith could slap together some iron, call it authentic, and watch the coins roll in. And visitors? Oh, they ate it up. These devices were whispered about in drawing rooms and shown off with knowing smirks in Victorian galleries. It tickled that strange fascination with repressed sexuality, especially when you could pin the blame on the barbaric Middle Ages. Still, the myth took root. Even as evidence faded, the idea persisted. Like a ghost story passed from campfire to campfire, the vision of a woman shackled for virtue or for shame lived on in poems, pulp novels, and tawdry jokes. But tonight, here under your soft blanket, we're not just going to ask if they worked. We're going to ask something deeper: why people believed they existed at all. Why would anyone want to believe in them? Because when you peel back the rust and legend, you're left with something more human. A world where people feared betrayal, temptation, lust. A world where control over a woman's body meant more than love. It meant inheritance, pride, and power. You breathe deeply now, hearing the story unwind like a reel of old film. You step further into this sleepy labyrinth, and somewhere in the distance, someone's still fiddling with a rusty little key. You shuffle through a sleepy courtyard, now past damp ivy and echoing stone steps, and watch as a knight prepares to leave. His horse snorts clouds into the chilly morning. His armor clinks like wind chimes, but his eyes linger on the upper window of the manor. That's where she stands, his wife. Her hands rest quietly on the sill, her face unreadable. Below her waist, you wonder, does she wear one? That mythical belt of iron secured tightly by the man about to vanish across the world. For months, maybe years. The story goes something like this. A knight heading off to the Holy Land, or some dusty crusade, doesn't quite trust his wife. Or maybe he doesn't trust other men. So he slips her into a metal belt, locks it, and gallops off with the key jingling at his hip. Romantic, right. You imagine her face as the drawbridge lowers. Perhaps she waves. Perhaps she doesn't. Maybe her hand drifts to her waist, feeling the uncomfortable tug of straps, not meant to be worn long, let alone lived in. She turns slowly back inside. The belt stays with her. But the man, he's gone. Yet historians scratch their heads at this. For all the thousands of crusaders who left for Jerusalem or Constantinople, there's startlingly little proof that chastity belts were ever part of their packing lists. Not in the chronicles, not in the letters home, and certainly not in the archaeological record. The image is compelling, though. It tells you something about the fears of the time, or perhaps the fears of those telling the stories centuries later. You picture it now, a husband leaning in close on the night before departure. "Don't forget," he whispers, pressing a tiny iron key into her palm. "Your honor is my honor." It's almost poetic, also mildly terrifying. Even if the belt was more symbolic than real, the worry it represented was tangible. Women were expected to remain faithful in both action and thought. A single whisper of infidelity could ruin a reputation, void a marriage, or plunge an inheritance into chaos. And as you rest your head against a soft pillow, now here's where things get strange. The only known keys during the Crusader period were large, sometimes as big as a fist. Lock mechanisms were clunky and primitive. If these belts did exist, they'd have been wildly impractical. Not only to wear, but to make. Imagine convincing a blacksmith to forge you a customized undergarment that looked like a cheese grater crossed with a bear trap. You wince. And then there's the matter of trust. Medieval marriages, particularly among nobility, weren't exactly built on emotional intimacy. But even so many women managed estates, oversaw servants, and handled complex affairs while their husbands were away. That doesn't exactly sound like the life of someone waddling around in a steel diaper. Still, the idea persists. Some late medieval literature and ballads even mock the concept, laughing at jealous husbands and the ridiculous things they do to keep their wives pure. One such poem includes a wife casually tossing a duplicate key to her lover once the husband's back is turned. Another describes a servant who simply unscrews the hinges while the woman giggles behind a curtain. Was it a cautionary tale? A joke? An anxious fantasy? Historians still argue whether these stories were based on any grain of truth or just the medieval equivalent of locker room gossip. And honestly, isn't that part of the charm? You're not here tonight for concrete answers. You're here for the strange, the dreamy, the maybe it could have been. A breeze stirs the imaginary candlelight in your mind. The night has long disappeared into the fog. The manor is quiet now, and somewhere a lady paces across the cold stone floor, perhaps free, perhaps shackled, perhaps both at once, and you wonder what sort of love demands a lock. You imagine her hands reaching down to check if the buckle is still secure, not out of need, but out of habit. You imagine the soft sigh she lets out when no one is watching, and maybe the little metal key wasn't carried off by her husband at all. Maybe she hid it under a loose floorboard, or maybe she never needed one to begin with. You find yourself now in a quiet room, part library, part museum, part curiosity cabinet. Shelves sag under the weight of dusty volumes, velvet-wrapped tools, and things that don't quite fit into categories. This is where myths come to rest, and sometimes where they wake up again. You're drawn to a glass case near the center, softly glowing under dim lamplight. Inside it, resting on a satin cushion like a crown jewel, lies a chastity belt. Or so the little plaque claims. But when you lean in closer, you notice something odd. The iron looks too crisp, too unblemished. The rivets seem more ornamental than functional. And the size. Well, either medieval women were the size of modern toddlers, or someone's playing a very long prank. This is where the plot thickens. Because as it turns out, many of the chastity belts displayed in museums throughout the 19th and 20th centuries were not medieval artifacts at all, but theatrical fakes manufactured centuries later, sometimes by clever craftsmen, other times by outright con men. You take a sleepy step back, watching as the illusion of authenticity begins to flicker. During the Victorian era, collectors and curators had a fascination, some might say, obsession with anything they could label as barbaric. The Middle Ages were their perfect scapegoat. The darker and more grotesque, the better. So when a mysterious metal object surfaced with straps and locks and the faint outline of something obscene, well, people were eager to believe it came from a time of knightly oaths and trembling maidens. Except it didn't. Most of these belts were created in the 1800s, not the 1300s. Their makers weren't medieval blacksmiths protecting maidenhood. They were likely vendors capitalizing on people's curiosity, arousal, and revulsion. You can almost hear them laughing as they peddled their wares. Step right up. See the shocking secrets of the savage Middle Ages. Some even went further, staging entire pseudo-historical exhibits around these devices, complete with suggestive illustrations and wild tales of tortured virtue. Visitors clutched their pearls. Children stared wide-eyed. The myth thickened, and because people believed it, it stuck. What's funny is that the few real examples that do exist, if we can even call them that, seem to come from Renaissance Italy, and France. And even then, the surviving artifacts are surrounded by question marks. Were they used? Were they ceremonial? Were they prototypes, never worn at all? Historians still argue whether any of these were meant for actual human bodies or merely crafted for the macabre gaze of later generations. Some suggest they were used for moral theater, paraded through town squares, perhaps as warnings or punishments. Others think they were never worn by women at all, but by mannequins or metaphors. You move past the case now and open an old sketchbook resting nearby. The pencil lines are delicate, almost intimate, and the designs inside are equal parts fascinating and disturbing. Belts shaped like clamshells, others like iron underwear with comically oversized keyholes. Some even boast little spikes. Yes, spikes. You blink. The idea was that if a woman wore one of these, any attempt to break in would be met with pain on either side. It sounds terrifying, and also medically, logistically, laughably absurd. Think about it. No modern plumbing, no antibiotics, no antiseptics. And here we are talking about people possibly putting rusted spiked iron next to some of the most sensitive parts of the human body. You wince under your blanket. Even modern replicas made for theater or curiosity cabinets tend to include padding because otherwise they'd be unwearable even for 10 minutes, let alone months. But again, these sketches served more as symbols than instructions. They told a story not about reality, but about fantasy, about power control, paranoia, and sexuality. And it's important to remember, the people drawing these weren't neutral observers. Many were men writing and sketching for other men, filtering their ideas of women through layers of fear, desire, and dominance. The chastity belt in this context wasn't about protection. It was about possession. You pause for a moment. Isn't it strange you think that the idea of a locked woman still echoes louder than her own voice? You lie there now half buried in your covers, the memory of those strange iron relics fading into the shadows of your thoughts. It's hard to tell what's real anymore. The belt, the drawings, the idea. But maybe that's the point. Like the stories whispered at sleepovers or campfires, the chastity belt lives not because it was true, but because it was too intriguing not to believe. It's the embodiment of historical telephone, each retelling more bizarre than the last, until fact and fiction are fused like rust to metal. And there, in the soft quiet of your room, you start to realize that the real tale isn't about the belt at all. It's about the minds that imagined it feared. It needed it to exist. And now you half asleep are part of that long chain of believers and doubters. You wander now through an even stranger gallery, not a room of relics, but of ink and parchment, illuminated pages filled with laughing faces, exaggerated body parts, and the kind of drawings that make monks raise their eyebrows. Welcome to the curious corner of medieval satire. There's something oddly endearing about it all. You're not looking at serious records here. You're flipping through the equivalent of medieval memes. Margins filled with snails, jousting knights, monkeys, swinging swords, and yes, cartoonish women in chastity belts being helped out of them by grinning locksmiths. You pause over one such image. It's from a manuscript dated to the late 1400s. The belt is absurdly large. The man beside it is twirling a key in his fingers. The woman, she's smirking, not frightened, not ashamed, just in on the joke. And it is a joke. Historians still argue whether these marginalia reflected actual social practices or merely poked fun at popular fears. But one thing is clear. The belt, even in these early illustrations, wasn't a solemn device of virtue. It was slapstick. It was commentary. It was a punchline. You think about how humor works. Even now, we joke to disarm what scares us. Sex, betrayal, vulnerability. These are all heavy topics. Wrap them in a cartoon belt with a ridiculous lock, and suddenly you're laughing instead of trembling. But there's something else buried in these sketches, a kind of rebellion. The artists who drew them, often scribes or bored apprentices, weren't necessarily echoing the beliefs of the elite. They were mocking them, taking the absurdity of male control of the idea that virtue could be padlocked and exposing its silliness. One belt has a label underneath that reads, loosely translated, "Only the fool trusts iron over love." You smile. That one could be a tweet. It gets weirder. In some German manuscripts, the belts are shown with labels like the widow's shame guard or the spinster's gate. These weren't engineering diagrams. They were visual puns, moral smirks, gossip turned into art. And while some might argue, well, if they drew it, maybe it existed, others would point out that these drawings also featured dragons that play the bagpipes and bishops wrestling with bears. Existence on the page doesn't always translate to reality in the world. Still, the persistence of the image says something. It meant something to people. Even if it was a fantasy or a joke, the chastity belt was shorthand, a symbol of anxiety, control, and obsession with female sexuality. You pause here in your dreamlike walk and sit on an imagined wooden bench beneath a stained glass window. You close your eyes. The candlelight of a scribe's chamber flickers behind your eyelids. You hear quiet laughter, the scratch of quill on parchment, the whispered words of two monks joking about Sir Thomas's padlocked bride. There's a curious comfort in knowing that people in the 1400s were in some ways just as weird as we are now. And then you turn a corner and the drawings shift again. Now they're more serious. Italian woodcuts from the 1500s, where the belts are stylized and placed on mannequins with elaborate garments. Not worn, displayed, and not for protection, but for attention. Some scholars suggest these were meant for theater moral displays, or perhaps even fashion satire. Like a sculpted corset, no one could sit down, and impractical, on purpose. One such sketch bears a small Latin phrase underneath easily missed virtus non vincitur ferro. Virtue is not conquered by iron. You let that sit for a moment. It's odd, isn't it? That the most powerful part of the myth might not be the belt itself, but the idea that someone believed it could work. That virtue was a thing you could screw tight with bolts, tuck away beneath skirts, and forget about. But bodies don't work like that. Hearts certainly don't. And you drifting now closer to sleep can feel the tension ease as that idea falls away like a dropped chain. You think back to the smirking woman in the drawing, the one who didn't look scared at all. Maybe that's the real secret, that women throughout history, in every era and every sketch, knew more than the stories gave them credit for. Now, you shift into a dream where the belt is no longer an idea, no longer a symbol, but an object, a thing you could in theory actually wear. And that's where things begin to itch. Literally. Imagine for a moment you're no longer in a story. You're in a body. The sun is high over a cobbled village square, and you're a woman in the year 1430, forced to walk across town wearing something made of unlined, hand-riveted metal. No padding, no ventilation. Just iron against skin, rubbing, pinching, heating up in the sun. Freezing in the winter, and utterly indifferent to hygiene. You shift under your blanket, now grateful that your sleepwear doesn't require a blacksmith. Because here's the truth. Most museums won't engrave on plaques the actual wearability of these so-called chastity belts is extremely questionable. Even the few surviving examples, those grim iron contraptions with tiny locks and absurdly small waistbands, would barely survive an afternoon's walk, let alone weeks or months of real use. And you know how fast medieval infections could spread. One scratch, one sore, one poorly timed sweat session, and suddenly you're not worried about virtue. You're worried about gangrene. Historians still argue whether any such device could have been used practically for more than an hour or two without causing serious medical issues. There's no mention in any known medieval medical texts of women being treated for chastity belt sores. No special salves for iron bruises. No records of blacksmiths adjusting belt sizes to fit a growing maiden, and don't even get started on bathroom logistics. Some surviving belt designs do include small slits or holes at the relevant places, but the practical challenges of relieving oneself without removing the entire apparatus are, well, not exactly bedtime friendly. Let's just say you wouldn't want to sneeze too hard. You picture it now, a peasant woman, bent over a bucket, fumbling with a complicated latch, while outside her cottage, a cow is mooing impatiently for milking. Not exactly the tale of knightly romance and protected virtue were sold in fiction. But someone must have tried to wear it. Right? Possibly, but not necessarily as a method of long-term abstinence. There's one fringe theory, equal parts sad and strange, that some chastity belts might have been used briefly during times of mental illness, imprisonment, or even as punishment. There's an unsettling possibility that a woman deemed mad or promiscuous might have been forced into such a device, not by a loving husband, but by her guardians or community. Yet, even this remains speculative. There's very little evidence, and a whole lot of Victorian fantasy filling in the gaps. And while your modern mind reels at the discomfort, the chafing, the raw metal-on-skin madness of it all, remember, these people in the Middle Ages did have bodily awareness. They weren't cavemen. They knew about rashes. They knew about infection. They knew when something felt wrong. If something was unwearable for a full day, they'd have known. And so the idea of a woman walking around for weeks in an iron belt seems less like history and more like a bad plot from a very uncomfortable play. That said, discomfort wasn't always seen as a bad thing in the Middle Ages. Sometimes it was the point. You think of hair shirts worn by monks, iron collars worn by penitents. Self-inflicted discomfort was sometimes believed to cleanse the soul. Could chastity belts have been part of that culture of bodily control? Maybe. But again, historians argue, the records are frustratingly vague, and often the only people describing these belts are men. Men writing about women's bodies, women's behavior, and women's obligations, without ever having worn the belt themselves. You can almost hear them from centuries past. Of course it works. She's locked up like a treasure chest. What could possibly go wrong? Meanwhile, the woman in the story just rolls her eyes and reaches for the duplicate key hidden in her sleeve. There's a lovely old French folktale that tells of a blacksmith's daughter who was locked in a belt by her jealous suitor. She outsmarted him by sneaking into the forge at night, melting the lock, and replacing it with a working replica, then pretending nothing had changed. She married him the next week, and he never suspected. You smile, sinking deeper into your pillow. Real or not, that story captures the one truth that lives at the center of this whole sleepy tale. Control is an illusion. You can build a fortress around someone's body, but not their thoughts, not their heart, and certainly not their will. The belt then becomes less a historical device and more a metaphor for the futility of fear. And as you drift gently toward the edge of sleep, you find that the belt begins to vanish. It softens into silk. It crumbles into dust. And what remains is just a woman walking barefoot through a field, free and unwatched, and completely herself. You're walking now through a quiet corridor where the walls are lined not with iron belts or faded manuscripts, but portraits, oil paintings of noblewomen, merchants' wives, nuns, even peasant girls caught mid-laughter. Their faces seem to follow you as you pass eyes, gleaming with stories never written down. You pause beneath one, with particularly kind eyes. Her name is unknown, her gown simple, but beneath that painted smile, you can feel a quiet pressure, like someone holding in a secret too long. She isn't wearing a belt, but, oh, she's wearing something, expectation. This is where we begin to understand chastity in the medieval world wasn't enforced with metal. It was enforced with shame. You listen now as a village priest preaches about Eve's weakness and Mary's perfection. You watch as mothers hush their daughters when boys walk by. You hear the word purity passed around like a badge, and sometimes a threat. The real belt wasn't forged in iron. It was stitched into customs, woven into expectations, whispered into the ears of every girl too young to understand what it even meant. Because in medieval Europe, a woman's value, especially among the higher classes, was tightly linked to her reputation. Virginity wasn't just a virtue, it was currency, a guarantee of paternity, a bargaining chip in marriage contracts, and the mechanisms of control were everywhere, from head-covering laws to curfews to secluded convents for women too spirited to marry. Even garments were designed to reinforce the idea of modesty. High necklines, long sleeves, layers upon layers between a woman's skin and the outside world. You imagine it now, the mental weight of being watched not by a jealous husband with a key, but by society itself. Every glance measured, every laugh judged, every stray rumor a potential stain. And yes, sometimes women internalized this, believing their virtue wasn't theirs at all, but something loaned to them by fathers' husbands, or God himself. There's a record from 14th century Italy describing a noblewoman who, after being accused falsely of impropriety, locked herself in a closet for days, refusing food or visitors, saying she'd rather wither in darkness than bear false light. You picture her curled up in a linen shift, hands clasped, no iron belt around her waist, yet somehow she was more trapped than anyone ever could be, in metal. It's a sad, sleepy thought. But here's something even more fascinating. Many women didn't buy into the system. Quietly, cleverly, they resisted. Letters between friends included coded jokes. Female saints wrote diaries filled with biting wit. In marketplaces, women traded stories behind the stalls, rolling their eyes at clumsy husbands or flirtatious monks. And there's that delightful fringe tidbit tales of holy belts given to brides by their mothers, not made of iron, but of ribbon, laced with tiny charms. Not to prevent intimacy, but to ensure happiness, health, and fidelity. A different kind of magic, a gentler one. You pass another painting now. This one more elaborate, a lady with a book in one hand and a ring of keys at her waist. Not the key, not a chastity belt key. These are house keys, pantry keys, the keys to the whole estate. It reminds you while men feared female sexuality, they often depended on women's power in the home. And despite all the social fencing, many women held real authority over children, over servants, over finances, even over when and how their husbands were welcome to bed. Historians still argue whether this duality control in public power and private was a contradiction or a balancing act. But here's the sleepy truth. Most women weren't silent victims. They were managers, mediators, sometimes even manipulators. And you start to see it clearly now. The chastity belt, if anything, was a distraction. A symbol that let people pretend virtue could be enforced by objects. But in reality, it was culture gossip and quiet expectations doing most of the work. As you curl deeper into your blanket, you feel the weight of those invisible belts, the ones made not of steel, but of silence and smiles and staying in line. And somehow, they feel heavier than iron ever could. But the woman with the kind eyes, her portrait lingers in your mind. She seems to wink at you now. Just slightly. As if to say, they tried to lock us in. But we always found a way out. You drift now into the bustle of a sunlit medieval marketplace. Wooden stalls rattle with laughter. Goats bleat in the background, and the scent of roasted onions and damp straw curls through the air. Beneath a weathered awning, you notice a vendor gesturing animatedly to a small gathering of travelers, nobles, and nosy pilgrims. And there on the table beside him lies a belt. Not a belt for holding up trousers or securing tools, but a chastity belt, or at least something claiming to be one. You shuffle closer. It gleams with freshly polished brass, a bit too perfectly symmetrical. The vendor winks as he picks it up with exaggerated ceremony. Only the finest craftsmanship from Milan, he boasts, twirling the lock theatrically. Protect your daughters, your wives, your sisters. Peace of mind forged in iron. You try not to laugh, because you're in the 1800s now, not the 1300s. This bustling market isn't medieval. It's Victorian, and that belt, it's a clever lie sold to a crowd that's just gullible enough to buy into it. This is where the chastity belt gets a second life, not as a real device of control, but as an imaginary relic of a supposedly savage past. You see, by the 19th century, Europeans were obsessed with the idea that the Middle Ages were a time of ignorance, superstition, and cruelty. It helped them feel enlightened, superior modern. So when someone produced a strange iron contraption and said, "Look, what they used to do to women," people didn't question it. They nodded solemnly. They gasped. They paid. Victorian collectors snapped up these belts with glee, and museums began displaying them behind glass with dramatic labels. Authentic, medieval chastity belt, 15th century. But historians today, they roll their eyes, because many of those belts were made mere months before they were sold. Some even had tool marks from modern equipment. Others were designed so poorly that anyone with a basic understanding of anatomy could tell they'd never been worn. Still, the myth spread thanks in part to the Industrial Revolution. The newly literate middle class devoured pamphlets, novels, and penny dreadfuls filled with scandalous tales of jealous husbands, locked maidens, and secret affairs. The chastity belt was the perfect prop. It was titillating, shocking, and best of all, blameless. You could leer at the idea without admitting you were kind of into it. You imagine now a mustached gentleman in a top hat standing in a London parlor, gesturing dramatically toward a velvet-lined box. Here he says, "With gravitas is what those poor medieval women endured, and then with less gravitas. Would you like to touch it?" It became part of the spectacle industry. One famous traveling exhibit even combined authentic torture devices with chastity belts in a twisted collection called Secrets of the Dungeon. Patrons lined up for a peek, half horrified, half aroused. Historians still argue whether some of these belts were initially meant as sex toys or fetish objects repurposed later to look medieval. Because let's face it, some of the designs are too elaborate, too precise, too impractical to be anything else. But the deception worked. By the early 1900s, even encyclopedias were repeating the story without question. One 1911 entry solemnly described the chastity belt as a frequent feature of feminine virtue in the 14th century, completely unaware that most belts described as such hadn't even existed 50 years earlier. It's a little bit like finding a plastic dinosaur toy buried in your garden and declaring it a fossil. Convincing maybe. True, absolutely not. Still, the idea was sticky because it tapped into something deeper, something that has always existed across time, the belief that control of women's bodies equals control of society, that female desire, if left unchecked, could unravel the whole delicate tapestry of inheritance, marriage, and honor. The Victorian obsession with chastity belts was less about actual history and more about reinforcing that belief through fiction dressed up as fact. And you see it in the newspapers of the time, too. Articles warning of modern female boldness or lamenting the loss of the obedient daughter. One commentator even suggested bringing back certain ancient devices to stem the tide of suffragette independence. He didn't name the belt, but you can practically hear it jangling behind the words. You lie still, now, letting the noise of that marketplace fade into the background. You see the vendor still smiling, pocketing coins from his shiny, never-worn wares. You hear the whispers, the stories, the false memories piling up like fog around a street lamp. And you realize maybe the chastity belt didn't survive the Middle Ages, but it thrived in the modern imagination, because sometimes myths are more profitable than truth. And as you drift closer to sleep, wrapped in warm blankets instead of cold iron, you find yourself oddly grateful for the lie. Because in unraveling it, you've learned more about how people think, how they want to believe that the past was worse. So the present feels better. Now, you're slipping into a library, not one made of stone and torches, but of flickering candlelight and whispering voices. A quiet place somewhere between dream and memory. On the long tables lie open manuscripts, their pages yellowed, their margins doodled with absurdity. And in one curious volume, a man is holding a key, a woman is smirking, and a chastity belt is falling off like a slapstick prop. You chuckle softly, because in this chapter of our sleepy stroll, the belt is no longer fearsome or even symbolic. It's downright funny. Yes, funny. The medieval world had its darkness, sure, but it also had laughter. And among the oddest artifacts of that laughter are the chastity belt jokes. Not instructions, not inventories, not grim testimonials, but jokes. Hundreds of years old, smuggled into plays, poems, and sermons. You pass through a crowd of imagined villagers now huddled in a tavern, lit by fire and filled with ale. A traveling performer takes the stage, He's red-cheeked and winking, holding up a pretend belt made of sausage links. The crowd roars. The punchline: she may be locked, but the butcher knows the trick. Not exactly subtle, but definitely telling. Historians still argue whether these jests were pure fantasy or inspired by rare, real devices. But what's clearer is this: the idea of the chastity belt was always ridiculous to some people, even back then, which suggests that while fear and control existed, so did disbelief. Some clergy sermons even mocked overly jealous husbands by painting them as fools who locked up their wives only to be cuckolded by the locksmith. A classic tale went like this: a man locks his wife in a belt and leaves town. His best friend visits, sweet-talks the wife, and she replies, "He locked me up with one key, but I made 3 more. You snort into your pillow." Then there's the tale of the clever peasant girl who wore a chastity belt to a local dance and charged boys a copper coin to knock and guess the keyhole. No one ever got it right, of course, but she left with a heavy purse and a wink. It's hard not to admire her. You pause beside another dusty book and glance at a scribbled note in the margin, added centuries later, by a bored student monk. Better a lock that opens twice than a key that never fits. The human brain hasn't changed that much. Has it? Even in the Renaissance, when the idea of chastity belts briefly resurfaced, you find artists portraying them more as visual jokes than as tools of morality. A 16th century Italian woodcut shows a woman lounging in bed, the belt discarded on the floor, while a smirking page boy creeps out the window. Over the fireplace hangs a sword-shaped key absurdly large. Satire plain and simple. It reminds you that medieval and early modern people weren't naive. They understood that control could be farcical, that trust wasn't enforced with bolts and chains, but broken with winks and whispers. The chastity belt in these stories becomes the butt of the joke, not the seal of virtue. And perhaps buried in the humor was a protest, a quiet rebellion against rigid norms. By making the belt laughable, people were stripping it of its imagined power. In one French farce, a merchant returns from a journey and finds his wife dancing with a local priest. He points furiously to the belt around her waist, demanding to know how this could happen. The priest simply says, "Locks don't stop love, my son. They only slow down the curious." You lie still hearing the echo of that phrase. Slow down the curious. It makes you wonder if the myth endured not because it was true, but because it offered a strange comfort. After all, a locked belt implies control. It allows people to believe their fears are solvable, containable, like putting a lid on a boiling pot. But love, trust, desire, those things don't stay locked for long. They slip through cracks. They find duplicate keys. So the joke, it turns out, was always on those who believed too strongly in the lock. And tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, you carry with you not fear, not rusted legends, but laughter, soft, mischievous, eternal. Because even in the most rigid stories, the heart always finds a way to wiggle free. Now you meander through a quieter place where myths drift like mist through the trees, cool and swirling, half-formed. Here, the air feels heavy with belief. You walk among ideas, not artifacts, and all around you, the same image repeats: a woman locked away, a key dangling from a man's belt, a promise or a threat meant to last forever. You're in the garden of legend now, where the chastity belt blooms not from fact, but from fantasy. Because even as historians shake their heads and museums revise their labels, the story clings on. The myth of the chastity belt travels faster and deeper than the truth ever could. Why? Because it's too good a story. You feel it now, that odd magnetic mix of taboo, romance, cruelty, and curiosity. The ingredients of every juicy tale since time began. A locked belt on a beautiful maiden, a lonely knight riding off to war, a forbidden lover hiding in the shadows. It writes itself. And write it, people did. By the 18th and 19th centuries, novels and plays across Europe were teeming with dramatized versions of chastity belt tales, some tragic, some comic, all exaggerated. One popular story told of a noblewoman whose husband went on a pilgrimage, leaving her secured. She was devout and obedient until the blacksmith's apprentice fell in love with her. He forged a duplicate key, and the two lovers met each night in silence. When the husband returned, he found the belt untouched, the seal unbroken, but a baby already born. The husband fell to his knees, crying, "How can this be?" And the wife replied, "A lock cannot guard what love has already set free." Historians still argue whether this tale was ever believed as truth or simply passed around like gossip growing with every retelling. Either way, it struck a nerve. And so the story spread. Across Europe, the image of the belt became a kind of moral shorthand. It appeared in illustrations and political cartoons, even in early medical texts, though rarely with any consistency. Sometimes it symbolized chastity, sometimes oppression, sometimes cleverness, sometimes tragedy. Like a mirror, the chastity belt reflected whatever fears or fantasies the viewer already carried. You picture now a young Victorian woman reading one of these stories by lamplight, blushing heart, racing, not because she believes it happened, but because she wants to believe it could have, that someone somewhere might have cared enough or feared enough to try to control love with iron. It's a little like believing in dragons or sea monsters. You don't need evidence. You just need the feeling that it fits. The belt became a way to talk about things that made people uncomfortable. About sex, about trust, about women's autonomy, about the idea that desire is dangerous and must be locked away. You glance upward now through the mist and see a series of faint silhouettes, ghostly belts from centuries of imagination. One has roses etched into the metal. Another is wrapped in chains. A third looks suspiciously like modern lingerie, just with added locks. It's a carousel of contradictions. Were chastity belts about purity, about punishment, about humiliation, about fashion? The answer is yes, and also no. It depends on the storyteller. You pass a strange signpost in this dream space. It reads, "Here lies the truth, lost in the shadows of belief." And you can't help but smile. Because this is the strange power of myths. They're not constrained by fact. They grow wherever they're needed. One scholar once said that myths function like emotional tools. They help societies manage their anxieties. The chastity belt, then, is less a piece of hardware and more a cultural coping mechanism born of fear, polished by fantasy, and immortalized through repetition. And like any good myth, it adapts. In some 20th century retellings, the belt becomes a symbol of women's oppression. In others, it becomes a symbol of their control. They choose to lock themselves to test men's patience or devotion. In modern times, it even sneaks into fashion shoots and films reimagined as edgy, provocative, ironic. You roll onto your side, now half dreaming, half awake, and you realize the strangest thing: this ancient device that likely never existed has outlived empires, kings, revolutions, and reason. Because people don't preserve iron, they preserve ideas. The chastity belt, ridiculous and impossible though it may be, has endured not as a truth, but as a mood, an echo of everything people have ever feared or misunderstood about love, about control, about trust. And you, drifting in your own story, begin to let go of the need for certainty. You don't need to know if it really happened, because the whisper of it, the shimmer of the myth, has already done its work. You sit now in a quiet chapel, stone walls cooled by centuries' beeswax candles, flickering the faint scent of lavender and limestone in the air. It's peaceful here, sacred and just a little somber. A woman kneels before the altar, hands folded not in prayer, but in thought. Her fingers tremble ever so slightly, not from piety, but from doubt. Because now we come to the question that truly haunts this tale. Did anyone actually wear one? You squint through the fog of history, peering into dusty corners of scholarship gossip and gray area evidence. And the answer, like most late-night riddles, is frustratingly foggy, maybe possibly very rarely. Historians still argue whether any real person in medieval Europe ever wore a chastity belt, as we imagine them iron-locked long-term. Some believe there were isolated cases, not widespread, not routine. Just rare, exceptional, tragic, perhaps. There's the much-debated case of a belt found in a 16th-century Austrian tomb, too small to fit an adult, poorly constructed, and likely ceremonial, or even theatrical. Some say it was never meant to be worn, just displayed. Others wonder if it was a one-off punishment, or maybe even a misidentified torture device. You move your hand slowly across the soft fabric of your blanket, relieved that your bedtime garments contain no bolts or latches. There's also a curious letter from Renaissance Italy, where a merchant writes of a belt commissioned for his daughter, lest temptation find her in our absence. But the tone feels off more metaphor than fact, a kind of boastful warning, or perhaps a protective father's overly poetic flourish. And then there are the rumors, passed along in footnotes and second-hand texts. A French noblewoman who wore a girdle of honor, supposedly padlocked. A Spanish nun whose diary vaguely mentions a device of denial during her novitiate. But these are shadows, not evidence. Even more tantalizing are court records from the 17th century in which two women testified that a neighbor kept his wife caged like a bird with straps and bars. Yet the description reads more like emotional abuse than an actual chastity belt. The imagery may be metaphorical, an exaggeration of domination, rather than a literal iron cage. Still, you wonder, could someone somewhere have truly worn one, not as myth, not as mockery, but in earnest, maybe? But here's the twist. If they did, it probably wasn't during the Middle Ages at all. Most verifiable examples of worn chastity devices come from much later in the 19th and early 20th centuries, not to prevent infidelity, but to curb masturbation. You blink. Yes, that's right. During a brief and rather alarming medical panic, some European and American doctors prescribed anti-masturbation belts to teenagers, patients, or hysterical women. Some were made of metal, others leather. Some included spikes, or alarms, horrifying in theory, ineffective in practice. It's one of those fringe historical tidbits you wish weren't true. A reminder that the quest to control the body doesn't always fade with time. But as for our romanticized medieval chastity belt, the one left behind by nights locked with love or paranoia. It remains mostly legend, and you feel the tension in your shoulders ease a little, because the truth, as odd as it sounds, is more comforting than the fiction. The image of women walking around in rusted undergarments, rattling like haunted wind chimes, wasn't the norm. If anything, it was a post-medieval fantasy layered with insecurity and guilt. You return to the chapel in your mind. The woman at the altar finally stands. She isn't wearing iron. She's wearing linen. Her gown flows softly, her waist unbound. She leaves the chapel without looking back. She, like you, has realized something. Freedom doesn't come from unlocked belts. It comes from seeing through the story. And maybe that's why the myth lingers, because the possibility of the belt still tugs at our need to explain history with symbols instead of complexity. The belt becomes the scapegoat, the emblem, the easy shorthand. A single object to carry the burden of 1,000 fears. But history, as you've learned tonight, is rarely so neat. Now you step into a grand hall cold with stone and echoing with quiet walls, lined not with paintings or relics, but with contracts, scrolls, and wax seals. This is the space where marriages were made, not in chapels or gardens, but through arrangement. And this time the chastity belt has nothing to do with love. It has everything to do with economics. Because tonight, as you rest, we turn not to the body, but to the price tag attached to it. You wander down the rows of shadowy desks, each one lit by a flickering candle, where scribes are hunched over parchment, scribbling out dowries with quills dipped in walnut ink. The ink flows thick with expectation. Number of sheep size of land value of clothing, and somewhere near the bottom, one quiet but critical line. The bride is assumed to be a virgin. Assumed, not proven, not tested, not guaranteed, but still heavily implied. You trace that word with your finger, because this is where the chastity belt, as an idea, not necessarily as an object, starts to make a twisted sort of sense. For noble families, a daughter's virginity could mean the difference between a modest dowry and a kingdom. Her virtue was proof that any heir born of the union was legitimate. A single indiscretion could ruin alliances, sever lineages, cast doubt on bloodlines. So even if no iron belt clanked beneath her silk skirts, she still lived with the weight of being watched. Carefully groomed, tightly, chaperoned, her behavior was part of the family's value system. And it wasn't just nobles. Among merchants, tradesmen, and the growing bourgeoisie, a girl's reputation could elevate or devastate her family's social standing. A rumor alone could lower her market value. It's cold, but it's true. In this system, women were expected to carry their family's hopes, not just in their hearts, but in their wombs. You pause at a window, now looking out into a moonlit garden. A young woman walks slowly beneath the trees. She holds her hands together, not in prayer, but in resignation. Not chained, not belted, but burdened all the same. There's a quiet record from 15th century Bruges where a father sued his daughter's betrothed for calling off their engagement. The groom claimed she'd already been seen in the orchard with another. The daughter swore nothing happened, but it didn't matter. The engagement dissolved, her dowry was returned, and she spent the rest of her life as a lace maker in a convent. No chastity belt, no lock, just a rumor and a door forever closed. Historians still argue whether this level of control was more oppressive than the mythical belt itself, because at least with a belt, the chains are visible. Reputation, on the other hand, is invisible and fragile, a thing that can vanish with a whisper and never come back. And here's the most bizarre twist: there were ways of trying to prove virginity. None scientific. All ridiculous. Some involved white cloths, others questionable physical tests, and still others relied entirely on gut feeling or the girl's ability to blush convincingly. It's no wonder then that the fantasy of the belt took hold. It offered an impossible certainty, a way for anxious husbands, fathers, and suitors to pretend that a keyhole could substitute for trust. But women were never truly passive in this. You pass now a table where two women sit, whispering heads close together, giggling behind their hands. One of them is clutching something what looks like a small leather purse, but inside it contains a false token, a carefully placed stain, a bit of goat's blood, enough to fool a new husband into believing that all was exactly as expected. It sounds dramatic, but these tokens existed. They're referenced in plays and letters in court cases. And they worked because people wanted to believe in symbols more than in people. So even without a belt, a woman's body was treated like a sealed letter, readable only when opened by the right man, at the right time, with the right expectations. You stretch your legs under the covers, the blankets warming your skin, and feel a flicker of gratitude that love in your time doesn't usually come with parchment terms and wax seals. Still, the past lingers. You remember now a proverb from Florence. A woman's price is in her silence. You whisper it once in your mind. It echoes too loudly. And yet, you begin to notice the cracks in the system. Letters where women describe secret lovers. Diaries where noble daughters write of arranged marriages with bitterness and planned affairs with delight. Court cases where men were made fools by maids cleverer than locks. The chastity belt may not have existed in iron, but that didn't mean people weren't trying to break out of something. And often they did, because love and laughter and freedom, they always find their way through. The echoing hall fades now, and you find yourself walking among cloisters, columns and arches drenched in morning light, the hush of prayer, and the soft rustle of robes marking time. Here, amid the echo of chanting monks and devout nuns, the chastity belt takes on yet another shape, not as punishment, not as fashion, not as satire, but as virtue incarnate. Because in this world, we're not talking about physical locks. We're talking about spiritual ones. You tiptoe beside a nun, kneeling before a carved Madonna, her fingers wrapped around a rosary lips, moving in silent repetition. She wears no belt, but around her waist is a cord, a girdle knotted not with locks, but with vows. The church, you see, loved symbols, and chastity was a favorite. From early Christian saints to medieval mystics, purity was praised as the highest calling, especially for women. So what better way to represent this than with a belt, a girdle of chastity they called it sometimes? Not metal, not even leather, just cloth, rope, sometimes even flowers. In this context, the belt wasn't about control from the outside. It was a metaphor for spiritual strength, inner discipline. The kind of belt you put on not to protect your body, but to preserve your soul. You think of the 13th century mystic Mechthild of Magdeburg, who wrote about girding herself with the belt of divine longing, or Saint Agnes, whose girdle was said to protect her from unwanted male attention through the sheer power of prayer. But as always, there's a flip side, Because while these spiritual metaphors could be empowering, they were also heavy. If a woman's worth was tied to virginity, then what happened when she failed, when she chose something else? That's when the church's metaphorical belts turned cold and tight. Women who stepped outside the bounds, real or imagined, faced shame, exclusion penance. Some were forced into nunneries. Others paraded in rags through town squares. A few were even branded with symbols of loose virtue. And so, the belt became part of the church's larger system of moral surveillance, not locked with keys, but reinforced through sermons, stained glass, and scripture. Historians still argue whether the church actively promoted physical chastity belts. There's no direct papal decree, no Vatican vault of jingling iron undergarments, but there are plenty of references to the virtues of binding desire, sealing temptation, and guarding the gateway of the flesh. Poetic, chilling. You walk now through a shadowy scriptorium where monks copy texts by candlelight. One is carefully illuminating a scene, a woman resisting a devil, offering her a jeweled belt. She looks away, hands pressed to her chest, her own girdle glowing gold. It's not iron. It's virtue. And that tells you something crucial. The medieval mind understood restraint not just as physical, but mystical. So when chastity belts appear in art, they're often not meant to be literal at all. They're allegories, emblems of piety, signals of resistance to temptation. Yet, even in this religious context, the idea of the chastity belt could slip into darker territory. You hear whispered accounts of penance belts worn by nuns who believed they had strayed too far in thought. Belts made of coarse rope, knotted tightly worn beneath habits, to cause constant discomfort as a reminder of sin. Not forced, but self-inflicted. Pain offered as proof of spiritual discipline. It makes you shiver under your warm blanket. And then there are the fringe stories. A few records mention devices in certain monastic orders to discourage women from self-pleasure. Mostly unverified, likely exaggerated, but again believed. And belief in this sleepy corner of history is often more dangerous than truth. Because when something is believed to be real, even without proof, it starts to act real. It shapes behavior, expectations, punishments. You walk now past a confessional carved from oak. A girl kneels inside, voice trembling, confessing that she thought impurely. The priest murmurs absolution, then quietly recommends a girdle of thorns, a symbolic punishment? Yes. But meant to hurt all the same. Still, not all religious uses of the belt were so bleak. In some wedding ceremonies, the groom gave the bride a girdle as a sign of trust, not control. A silken ribbon or a gold chain wrapped around her waist, not locked but tied. And she in return might gift him a glove or a key, a promise that no belt would ever be needed. So it wasn't all fear and repression. There was also tenderness, symbolism as comfort. But the line between metaphor and method blurred easily. You recall now a 14th century woodcut where a sainted woman floats into heaven, leaving behind a golden belt on the ground. The caption reads, "She locked herself to God." You stare at that image. The belt, once feared and fabled, now laid down freely. Not forced, not imposed, just released. And maybe that's the gentlest turn of all in this long, strange story. Because in the religious world of the Middle Ages, the belt wasn't always a trap. Sometimes it was a choice, one made, quietly, prayerfully, personally. Whether misguided or meaningful, it was hers to make. And tonight, in the hush of your own sacred space, your bed, your thoughts, Your dreams, you realize something soothing. No belt, no vow, no doctrine can bind the human heart forever. Eventually, even the tightest knots come undone. You wander now through an artist's studio in Venice, bright sun-streaked and dusted with pigment. Paintbrushes lie across polished wood silk drapes, sway in the breeze, and the smell of linseed oil blends with orange blossom. Here, the chastity belt is no longer punishment symbol or joke. It's decoration, because this is the Renaissance, and everything, especially suffering, can be made beautiful. You watch as a painter dips his brush into red ochre and begins outlining a reclining woman. She lies among cushions, one arm curled behind her head. Around her waist is not a real belt, but a gleaming ornament, metallic, delicate, and impractical. It isn't there to secure anything. It's there to suggest something. That's the shift you notice now. The chastity belt has become a fantasy accessory. By the 1500s and 1600s, art and literature had embraced the chastity belt, not as reality, but as metaphor, a visual flourish that signaled innocence, danger, or erotic tension, depending on who was looking. You see it in paintings, etchings, and even theatrical costumes. A noblewoman might wear a faux belt as part of an allegorical portrait, posing as virtue guarded or honor bound. It said more about ideals than actual garments. Think of it as the original Photoshop filter. One famous engraving, La Donna Cinta, depicts a woman clutching a giant ornate key while wearing a gold-trimmed girdle. She stares boldly at the viewer, not trapped, not ashamed. She is the guardian, not the guarded. And suddenly, the belt isn't about submission. It's about status. An accessory to remind viewers, this woman belongs to no one but herself, or perhaps to a distant lover whose absence makes her all the more desirable. Historians still argue whether these depictions reflect truth or taste. Were these symbolic chastity belts ever crafted, or just imagined on canvas? Most agree they were props, not prison, accessories, not appliances. Even fashion got in on the act. There's record of a Florentine court ball where women wore mock chastity belts made of silver lace embroidered with pearls. They jingled lightly as they danced, drawing attention to exactly the thing they were supposedly concealing. One observer wrote, "The virgins wore their virtue as armor, but it did not stop the eyes of every man in the room." It's ironic. In trying to display modesty, they showcased the very allure they claimed to guard. You stroll through this strange art world with a sleepy grin, because this is the belt's most theatrical form. Less cage, more costume. It becomes a prop in operas and comedies, often exaggerated for laughs or titillation. A dramatic soprano might whip off a prop belt on stage as her lover swoons. A comic play might feature a jealous duke, ordering one only to find it delivered to the wrong woman. You settle now on a velvet chaise near a stage curtain, watching the shadows of a dress rehearsal. Two actors fumble with an oversized belt and an enormous wooden key while the audience giggles behind paper fans. It's absurd. It's charming. It's art imitating a myth that was already a joke turned legend turned fashion again. And beyond the theater walls, the myth continued to evolve. Writers of the Romantic era, those masters of longing and melancholy, revived the chastity belt myth with renewed passion. For them, it wasn't about control, it was about tragedy. A woman locked away, yearning, misunderstood, pure and unreachable. The ultimate poetic muse. One particularly sappy 19th century poem describes a maiden sitting in a tower belt, locked tight heart, unlocked still. Her beloved returns from war only to die at her feet, never having touched her. The belt clinks once as she falls beside him, the key still warm in her hand. You sigh. It's over the top, yes, but it captures the mood of this phase in the belt's imaginary journey. No longer a historical curiosity, no longer satire. Now, it's part of romantic imagination, a canvas for every emotion, repression, devotion, isolation, longing. And somewhere in all that the truth is lost again. But do we really mind? You roll to your side, your blanket warm and soft, and realize this strange myth has become like a costume, passed down through centuries, resewn, repainted, rewritten for each new audience. It's never quite real, but it always feels familiar, because what the chastity belt represents, fear, desire, possession, pride, isn't bound to one time or place. It shifts, adapts, and survives. You see now that the belt was never just about the body. It was about the story. And in the world of art, the story is often more powerful than the truth. You find yourself now in a place far from painted halls and velvet theaters. No silk gowns, no pearl-studded belts, no romantic tragedy plays out here. Just a narrow dirt path through a damp medieval village, the air thick with chimney smoke, and the distant sound of sheep. And here, walking beside you, is the truth most often forgotten. A woman. Not a noble, not a duchess, not a heroine in a painting. Just a peasant. Her hands are cracked from soap and water, her dress patched at the knees. She lifts a bucket from a well, her back strong, her fingers calloused. She doesn't know what a chastity belt is. She's never seen one. And if she had, she'd laugh. Because the real chains medieval women wore were not forged from iron. They were made from custom, law, poverty, and the constant thrum of doing what had to be done. This woman's chastity wasn't guarded by locks. It was guarded by exhaustion, by isolation, by the weight of community eyes always watching. She couldn't afford scandal, not because of honor, but because she needed to stay housed, fed, and safe from gossip that could ruin everything. You walk beside her silently now, past the butcher, the baker, the tanner's apprentices, all of whom glance her way, but say nothing. She belongs to someone, or she doesn't. Either way, their eyes judge, calculate, dismiss. That's the belt she wears. In this small village, everyone knows everyone's business. Reputation is oxygen. And even the hint of impropriety could strip a woman of work shelter, even her place at church. Historians still argue whether peasants experienced the same moral pressures as the upper classes. After all, they were more concerned with survival than symbolism. But what's certain is this: even without belts or locks, their lives were controlled. Not by grand myths, but by daily necessity. Marriage wasn't optional for most, nor was obedience. Some village laws punished women for loose behavior with fines, public humiliation, or forced shaving of the head. Others forbade unmarried women from entering certain inns or gathering in groups after dusk. You imagine this woman now being scolded for laughing too loudly at market, for standing too close to the cooper's son, for walking alone past sunset. No belts, just boundaries drawn with whispered rules. And yet, she's not powerless. She knows the herbs that ease pain. She knows how to stretch bread dough and mend wool and barter for soap using yesterday's bones. She's no noble lady, but she runs her household with precision. She might not own land, but she holds influence in the rhythm of her village. There's even a faint smile at the corner of her mouth. You see now how the myth of the chastity belt ignores women like her. It imagines a world of drama and iron and keys and desire, but forgets the quiet strength of survival, the strength that says I am not locked because I cannot afford to be. And then there were women even poorer still. The vagrant, the washerwoman, the camp follower trailing soldiers with hope of coin. Their bodies weren't guarded by locks or gowns or fathers. They were exposed, vulnerable, too often taken, and society offered them no belts, no justice, only blame. In this light, the chastity belt becomes a dark joke, not because it was real, but because it wasn't, and yet society still expected women to behave as if it were. Still demanded they remain untouched, unsullied, silent. No iron needed, just pressure. Just the knowledge that stepping even an inch outside the line could mean ruin. And yet, the resilience remains. You pass a cottage window now and see a mother teaching her daughter to weave. The girl's small hands fumble the thread. The mother guides her, gently telling a story, something about a girl who couldn't be trapped, no matter what they tried. It's not a story about belts. It's a story about freedom. You realize, wrapped in your own cocoon of quiet and covers, that the myth of the chastity belt has always overlooked this kind of freedom. The quiet kind, the daily kind, the kind earned not with rebellion, but with persistence. And perhaps this is the softest truth of all. The real story isn't about who wore a belt. It's about who didn't and still survived. The road winds now toward twilight. The sky softens from gold to gray blue, and you find yourself walking slower, quieter. The questions that burned earlier, did they exist? Were they worn? Could they work? Have faded to echoes now. Because here at the sleepy edge of the journey, we arrive not at answers, but at understanding. You step gently into a room. Not a castle, not a convent, not a stage, just a room. Wooden floor wool blanket, a candle flickering in its dish. A woman sits by the hearth alone, brushing her hair. No key dangles from her neck. No belt binds her waist. But the idea of it lingers, not in iron, not in fear, but in something softer, stranger memory. In the way women are still asked how many. In the way girls are still told to be careful. In the words, we use pure, modest good words that pretend not to be locks, but are, because that's the final turn of this tale. Chastity belts may never have truly worked or even truly existed, not like the legends say, but their ghosts still do. You lie back now, the story winding down around you, and feel the gentle weight of centuries pressing like a blanket. Not heavy, just there. The belt began perhaps as a rumor, a joke, a warning, a fantasy. But it endured because it offered something so many people, men and women alike, secretly crave: certainty. The illusion that we can control what is wild, that we can lock what is vulnerable, that we can build a key to another person's soul. Historians still argue whether this belief ever left us, whether we've really moved on, or whether we've simply replaced iron with expectation. You think now of the woman from the painting, of the smirking girl in the tavern, of the peasant kneeling at the well. None of them wore belts, but all of them were watched. And yet, all of them lived. They worked, they danced, they whispered, they loved. Not because they were free of the myth, but because they moved anyway, around it, through it, beyond it. And that's the quiet triumph that history forgets to mention. You've walked through every version of the belt, now real and imagined, feared and mocked, worn and discarded. You've heard the clink of fake locks in Victorian exhibits. You've read the giggling marginalia in the corners of medieval books. You've seen the silver-threaded mock belts jingling at court dances. And you've heard the silence of women who didn't need metal to feel trapped. And now, you're here at the end. So what's left? You sigh the air in your chest warm and slow. You already know the answer. The chastity belt, real or not, was never about steel. It was about stories, and the people who believed them. And tonight, you've let that story untangle itself thread by thread, like a ribbon slipping quietly from a waist. You are not locked. You are not watched. You are not weighed. You are simply here, safe, still, free. Now let's gently let the candle burn low. Imagine the old studio, where the last fake belt was packed away, a museum quietly retiring the legend. Picture the soft rustle of a nun's gown as she walks barefoot through her chapel garden, humming to herself, no shame on her breath. Remember the peasant girl's calm hands as she draws water from the well, the muscles in her arms stronger than any lock ever forged. You are drifting now. The noise of debate, the clang of myths, the rustle of dusty books, they all soften, fading into the background. Let them go, because the real story, the one that matters most, is not about belts at all. It's about your mind, your body, your right to be both known and unknown, guarded and open, private and free. Your breath settles. Your limbs are light. Your heart is quiet. There are no keys here, no locks, no rules written in margins or iron, just softness, just the gentle unfolding of sleep. You did not need to survive this tale after all, because you were never trapped to begin with. Sleep well, my loves.